I'm here again with Larry Diamond. This has become a tradition. I think this is the third year in a row we've done a end of the year wrap up. We got through 2024 and we're now in 2025. And the little embers of optimism that we saw at various points last year have now been, I think, doused. I wish they were doused, the way I wish the embers in California were doused as effectively. But we do want to review the situation of global democracy around the world. Obviously, the big news from the end of last year was the election in the United States. We can get to that, but maybe you can, tell us about the year of. Let's start just talking about the year of elections and the kinds of lessons that we can draw from that.
Well, of course, it was quite a year, right? Mm-hmm. More people went to the ballot box to vote in competitive multi-party elections than in any year in human history, in part because if India's in the mix, that gives you a lot of voters right there. I don't know, 900 million or something. But, and if you want to start with the biggest democracy, let's start with India. The bad news is that a authoritarian-minded leader, a populist, Hindu nationalist leader, Narendra Modi, of a very illiberal party, the ruling party, the BJP, which has been pushing a Hindutva, Hindu nationalist agenda, with a lot of prejudice toward Muslims and minorities and liberals and critics and hostility to the media, and really executing a lot of the elements of what I call the Autocrat's 12-step program. This leader and this party were returned to power in the elections. Every 5 years, the parliamentary term is renewed in India. So Prime Minister Modi and the BJP have now embarked on their third consecutive term. The good news is that, it was a competitive election. It seems to have been very well conducted. And the ruling party lost its absolute majority, so they have to rule in coalition. And it was a kind of reminder that the Indian public, the Indian electorate, will judge performance, and if they don't perform, they could lose power in a subsequent election. I mean, the bad news in India is partly the authoritarian intent and skill of the ruling party, but partly also the disarray and lack of leadership of the opposition in India. So it's a mixed picture, and I'm worried about India, quite worried. The illiberal project continues to advance. And I think, Frank, what we've seen from Venezuela and what we've seen from Hungary, and what we've seen from Turkey is the longer that illiberal, populist, authoritarian-minded forces have in power, the more deeply they can pursue their agenda, and the further democracy slides back, either into being extremely illiberal or into not being democracy at all. And now, in the middle of the year in Mexico, you had the kind of left-wing authoritarian project of Andres Manuel López Obrador, AMLO, renewed for another 6-year presidential term. He couldn't run for re-election. Mexico has a one-term limit for the 6-year presidential term. But his chosen successor, Claudia Sheinbaum, was elected in a landslide, again facing a feckless and disorganized opposition. And they swept the Congress. They achieved a special majority that gave them the power to amend the Constitution. And so now they've pushed through this horrible amendment providing for direct election of judges, which is going to politicize the judiciary.
Well, not just politicize it, but a lot of the narco gangs are going to
Yes.
be able to take over a lot of these judicial positions. And
Right, so you've got really a double blow. The ruling party can get more favorable judges, but also so can organized crime. It's really alarming.
But South Africa is a different story. Right?
I think South Africa is different in two respects. Number one, although there is a ruling party, the African National Congress, that has been there for
since the beginning.
Yeah, since the first multi-party, multiracial elections in 1994. After 30 years, people are pretty fed up. And so, like the BJP, it lost its absolute majority, but after a longer period of time. And unlike in India, there is significant opposition. It varies in its democratic orientation. But probably the party that's most committed to liberal democracy and a market economy, the Democratic Alliance, it finished second, and now the ANC has gone into coalition with it. And things seem to be improving a bit, so I think that's a positive story. And then as long as we're on Africa, there were a few instances in Africa where losing parties lost, and there was rotation of power. The most interesting, in a way, was Botswana, because since independence in 1966, only one party had ever ruled in Botswana, and it had been such a long period of one-party domination that a lot of people said this isn't really a democracy. And you probably recall that famous line from Adam Shaworski of New York University that democracy is a system in which parties lose elections. So in his famous study of democracy and development, they actually didn't code Botswana as a democracy because between 1966 and their end date of their study, which might have been 1985, there'd never been a loss of an election. And that lasted for another 35, 40 years, and then they lost. And they actually went down, the ruling party, to a crushing defeat, and the longtime opposition, it was a multi-party situation, but came to power. And in Senegal, you had a two-term president, Macky Sall, who'd been increasingly abusive and, toying with the autocrats' 12-step program. And he really kind of tried to nibble away in various directions to amend the Constitution. This is what they do, to try and change it so he could get a third term. And he failed. But then it looked like his principal rival, who was the mayor of Dakar, the capital, was going to succeed him, which was too much for him to bear. So he managed to disqualify that candidate. And then the candidate who replaced him was elected. The opposition came to power in Senegal. And in December, the opposition, as predicted, came to power in Ghana. So we're seeing, a fair amount of spunk, of liveliness in sub-Saharan Africa. It's pretty interesting, but it coexists with a number of states, particularly in West Africa, where democracy has slid back, and particularly in the Sahel, where the military has come to power. And I just heard today, in a conference I was in, a Ghanaian speaker who said that at the inauguration last month for President Mahama, who had been president and then was out 2 terms and has now been returned to the presidency as an outsider, so a bit of a familiar story. The person who was cheered the most at the inaugural ceremony in Ghana, what is often considered to be maybe one of the 2 most vibrant liberal democracies in sub-Saharan Africa, is the general of Burkina Faso who staged the coup to close down democracy, a young guy. Anyway, so, in Guatemala, you had a turnover of power to a democratic figure, a Revelo, but he's struggling in the face of all that corruption. Sri Lanka, you had the, corrupt, long-time ruling family. They'd become almost an oligarchy, turned out of power, and power rotated to a kind of left populist figure, but, he seems inclined to govern democratically. At least it's a new chance. And if you want to step outside the electoral framework, of course, we were having our Summer Fellows program, our Fisher Family Summer Fellows program here at CDDRL at Stanford last summer, you'll recall, when the students rebelled in Bangladesh and overthrew a really nasty and corrupt authoritarian leader, Sheikh Hasina in Bangladesh. And I had developed a certain kind of bizarre fondness for Sheikh Hasina because she struck a blow for women's liberation by showing that women can also be populist autocrats and just as corrupt as the men. But anyway, she's fallen, and of course, someone that I think is a very interesting historical figure, the founder of the Grameen Bank, Mohammed Yunus, is now the interim president as Bangladesh tries to find its way toward democracy. So, it was a mixed bag last year around the world. There was progress. There was a lot of continuation of authoritarian momentum and democratic backsliding. But the instances in which people showed that the ballot box can send a signal to a misgoverning party, at least a warning sign, or even turn them out of power, that was pretty encouraging.
Yeah. Although we haven't spoken about Europe, and that I think is very worrisome at the present moment, because you now have two pro-Russian, autocratic members, Slovakia and Hungary, of course, although Orban has had some setbacks in the European parliamentary election. He's now got a real opponent. But I think the bigger worry is the big countries. Germany doesn't really have a government. They're going to have new elections, but they're very weak right now. France still has President Macron, but he may well be replaced by Marine Le Pen at the next election. And that's really the EU. I mean, those are the two key countries.
I completely agree with you. The EU elections for the European Parliament didn't go quite as badly as some people feared. It was more a reproduction of the existing balance with some...
Well, except that the parties of the left were really wiped out. The Green parties across the continent really lost out.
But you didn't, that's quite significant development. But you didn't have, the dramatic gains of the far right that people feared. But I fear that a right-wing juggernaut could be coming in Europe. And some of the other... You mentioned Slovakia, you mentioned, of course, Hungary, a complex story. I'm worried about Austria now, where the Freedom Party has been turned to lead a new government. I worry about the Netherlands and Wilders. I think that you have to take very seriously now the prospect not only that Marine Le Pen will win the next presidential election in France, but that it could come sooner than the 5-year term of Macron being fulfilled. I think he miscalculated very badly in calling for fresh National Assembly elections.
Although I think the big question about Marine Le Pen is actually whether she's really moved to the center. I mean, she certainly tried to appear that way.
I think you and I have, maybe a slight difference of interpretation here. I agree that she has, and she's certainly not her father, and she's not her niece or whoever has formed the more radical splinter
Well,
party.
she's got Eric Zemmour to her right at the moment.
But what worries me about her and what worries me about Giorgia Meloni, we've talked a little bit about this in the past, who, of course, has supported Ukraine and has not been the flamethrower that a lot of people feared. What worries me, and maybe this is a bridge now to our conversation about the United States, is that when you start seeing these populist right leaders winning power in a number of advanced industrial countries, maybe they're not going to be as tame as they might have been.
The goalposts will move.
When you had a more conventional, whether it's a Democrat or Republican, but in this case, Democrat, American president, and you didn't have an illiberal, authoritarian-minded president of the U.S. or of another powerful country. So it will be interesting to see whether Giorgia Meloni behaves differently as Prime Minister of Italy, and whether if Le Pen wins the presidency in France, they take on a different political coloration, both internally in their attitude toward democratic norms and externally in some of their alliance behavior than they would have if, say, Kamala Harris had been president.
Right.